The Rugby Football League Championship is the second tier of English Rugby League. Unlike their rugby union counterparts, it takes place over the summer, and considering that most of the teams are from the north of England, that's probably for the best. Anyway, the league has some interesting stadiums, and here they are. Matt Johnson Prestige Stadium, or Craven Park, but someone already has that name. It's been home to the Barrow Raiders since it opened, although they weren't called the Raiders back then. I guess the 1930s was too soon after the Vikings raided that it was deemed an inappropriate name. Having said that, World War II is not my forte. Anyway, despite being around for so long, it remains the smallest stadium in the league with a capacity of just 3,000. Fox's Biscuits Stadium, Batley Bulldogs. It also goes by the name Mount Pleasant, which is quite fitting because, as you can see, it's set atop this mountain of Himalayan proportions. How do they even breathe at this altitude? The layout of the stadium is quite haphazard, with a mix of small seated stands, open terracing, and nothing. I should also mention that the field has a fairly prominent slope to it. But I mean, come on, try making a level playing field atop Mount Everest and see how flat it is. Odsal Stadium, Bradford Bulls. Well, this is certainly an interesting design. Just looking at it, you know it must have an interesting history. A lot of stadiums were built in a similar style back in the day, with a main stand that had a roof and often seating, with the rest of the field being surrounded by a terraced embankment. Usually the field isn't sunken so low into the ground though. That's due to the fact that it was built on the site of a former quarry. Certainly not the only stadium that can say the same. Most of these style of stadiums have since been developed into modern ones, but the only major change here has been the addition of this corporate hospitality section to the south. The Tetley Stadium, Dewsbury Rams. You've got a biscuit company and now a tea company sponsoring the stadiums. That's not the England I know. Oh, hang on a sec, this isn't Tetley the tea brand, it's Tetley's a brewer. But once again, I didn't think English people drank beer. We have two matching grandstands that don't run the full length of the pitch and a small open terrace. Nothing flashy, but nice and tidy. The Millennium Stadium, Featherstone Rovers. They've been at the ground since it was built back in 1904, which is impressive considering that the sport had just been created less than a decade prior. It's kept changing bit by bit over the years, including the addition of seats in this stand which was a terrace. Interestingly, the seats were taken from a stadium in Scarborough that was demolished. To be clear, they didn't steal them, they had permission. This is Yorkshire, not Liverpool. I'm only kidding. The Shay, Halifax Panthers. Built just over 100 years ago for the Halifax Town Football Club, who were the main tenants up until they ceased to exist in the late 2000s. Their successor club plays here though. But the Panthers have been here longer. Anyway, it's one of my favourites in the league. There's a tasteful blend of old and new, and I just love the way the branches of those trees are overhanging the top of the old-fashioned West Stand. It's actually quite a cosy little stadium. Well, I shouldn't say little, it's the second biggest in the league. Leigh Sports Village, Leigh Centurions. It's also the home of Manchester United, if you disregard the first team. I think this stadium might be the most normal so far. That's neither a compliment or an insult, it's just that all the stands are matching, there's no empty spaces or oddities, just a standard modern stadium built on a moderate budget. Plough Lane, London Broncos. Although rugby league is more of a northern sport, as I mentioned earlier, London is just too big of a market not to have a team. I mean, you could probably have an Australian rules football team in London, if it weren't for the fact that no one had heard of the sport. Plough Lane, as you may already know, was built primarily for AFC Wimbledon. That's why it's named after Wimbledon's old ground. But for 2022, the Broncos have decided to become the ground's second tenant. Well, perhaps the 400th. If you include the apartments. Kingston Park, Newcastle Thunder. Overall, it's a fairly standard modern rugby stadium, except for this one stand over here that appears to be attached to a house. I'd like to think that it was some stubborn homeowner who didn't want to sell their house to the developers, but instead turned it into a stand and profiteered from it. But no, it's just a stand that looks like a house. Also, the uncovered terrace here will most likely eventually be given a roof. I know it's held in the warmer months, but we're not too far from Scotland, so that's not particularly relevant. Olympic Legacy Park, Sheffield Eagles. Built just this year on the site of one of their former homes, Don Valley Stadium, which was demolished. I suppose that goes without saying, as does the fact that it's the newest stadium in the league. Rugby league in general, perhaps. The name Olympic Legacy Park is referring to the London Olympics. Up until now, I thought Sheffield was its own city in the north of England, but clearly it must be a suburb of London. It's a very simple stadium, but the one and only stand has a rather nice brick exterior. LEL Arena, Whitehaven. Bit unusual for the largest stand to be behind the posts, simply because it's usually not considered the best viewing angle. But I suppose the backdrop is rather nice. There are plans to renovate the stadium, giving 3 sides covered stands and the remaining end given a building known as the Hub. For now, it remains a basic stadium with only a small section of actual seating. DCBL Stadium. Or is that Decibel Stadium? Widnes Vikings. Or is that Vidnes Vikings? The stadium is sponsored by a debt collector, which is funny because second-tier rugby league clubs aren't particularly known for their financial stability. But keep your friends close and enemies closer, I guess. They do share the stadium with 2 other teams, so that should keep them away. They are the primary tenants though, hence the Vikings on the seats. It's a pretty generic design, but one that works. Derwent Park, Workington Town. Ironically, the unemployment rate in Workington is more than twice the national average. Anyway, sitting right by the River Derwent is perhaps the most unusual stadium in this league, for obvious reasons. But a racetrack around the field was quite a common feature back in the day, whether it be for greyhounds or a speedway as it is in this instance. It's just a good source of additional income, but it comes at the price of spectator proximity. York Community Stadium, York City Knights. It opened just last year as part of a greater sports, health, education and entertainment complex, which explains the community in the title. It's one of the few all-seater stadiums in the league. Speaking of the seats, the combination of the colours of the Knights and York City, who also play here, looks rather vibrant, and I can't imagine many other stadiums share that same colour scheme. And that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, have a good one.